Fitness Pro Mentor community, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I love talking to established fitness professionals who are doing amazing things. And Johnny Cooke, Johnny Cookie, I'm saying today, Johnny Cooke of Precision Human Performance here with us again, third time. Johnny Cooke, how you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for having me back. I guess you ran through your list and gotten back to the bottom. So I'm happy.
Yeah, there are definitely the bottom of the people who are the least. No. You know what? I love having you on because you always say something that brings me down a peg or two, and it makes me feel less arrogant. And I stay. No, honestly, Johnny. I mean, anyone who's listened to the previous episode of Johnny and Michelle, you should check all of them out. All incredible. Johnny is really brilliant. I mean, he's comes across in a very professional way. Has a lot of great thoughts around really everything, exercise, business, and we've got some really cool stuff bioenergetics wise we're going to talk about. So Johnny, you're not the bottom of the list, you're at the top of the list, but I'm trying to have you on spaced out enough that people don't get bored of you. But I mean, how could they?
Thank you. No, I'm happy to be on, and thanks for having me again.
Yeah. Anyone quickly, if you're unfamiliar with Johnny, please check out Precision Human Performance and Bioacademics. And Johnny and Michelle collectively between the two companies have some really incredible courses, and we're going to dive into some of that today. So Johnny, you got some cool things that you're up to with this inflammation and exercise stuff. What is that all about?
Well, I don't know how interesting it is, but what? So let me take you back to the beginning. When I went back to school to get another master's degree, the exercise science course that I was in was heavily based in biochemistry and human disease. And that ties right into inflammation, which is kind of a subset of both the good and the bad of what we go through as humans. And it really sort of exposed me to the intricacies of what that is and why exercise is useful and how inflammation plays into it. And that just happened to intersect at a time in pop culture when inflammation was like a big buzzword and everyone was talking about it and how to avoid it and that it was bad. It was just being framed in a way that I thought didn't tell the whole story. And I felt a desire to shed some light on that. We've had a couple iterations of it. It's been kind of a trial and error, finding out where the rubber hits the road with that. In regards to, there's a lot to understand in regards to the physiology and the biochemical mechanisms that may or may not be entirely required for everyone to understand how to still have exercise parameters that help with inflammation and understanding the basics of inflammation resolution. So the course that you're talking about originally started off as just basically, it was about inflammation, the mechanisms of it. And I did a beta launch of that down in Florida. And at about, I don't know, 2 to 3 hours in on day one, I'm looking around and everyone is like a zombie. And I'm just like, oh shit, what do I do? Right? Like it was just too heavy, too deep for people who were looking for some practical things of what to do. And I'm giving them like 4 years of biochemistry slammed into like 2 days, and people just, I don't think it went well. Great information. So that sort of sent me back to the drawing board. And Michelle's always a really good sounding board for that because she does such a good job of thinking about things from a practical standpoint. Who are we trying to reach, and what's our motivation? Right? Is my motivation to impress people with biochemistry, or is my motivation to give other professionals practical information that they can use? And if they want more, I'm happy to give them more. But that was kind of the goal, right? What's this inflammation thing? What should we do with it? So we kind of went back to the drawing board, and I've got a second iteration that's coming out soon, which is, it's a bioenergetics course. And it has a large section of inflammation within that course, because how we use and don't use bioenergetics is a big part of what does and doesn't happen with inflammation in regards to an exercise intervention.
Well, listen,
So
that
that's a long way of saying I did something that was too much. It sucked, and now I've gone back to the drawing board, and hopefully I've putting together something that's practical that helps people understand what inflammation is and how to use it to their um, benefit, and to not be afraid of it, and to put it into context.
well, you said something just there that I'd love to ask about. You said, "Do we choose to use bioenergetics or not?" And I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that framing because that's kind of an interesting way. I always thought of it was it's just something that's there and we have to learn how to work with it. But
Sure. I mean, bioenergetics is just a fancy way of saying, life energy, right? How we produce energy to do tasks that we want to do, and it's a complex system that is also very specific to what we're doing, right? So the reason I phrase it like that is it, when I'm working with my clients, it's one of the things that I build into periodization, right? So, what ways and on what schedule am I challenging, for example, the ATP CP system, our first line of energy that has to do with really quick explosive things. On the other end of that spectrum, how am I scheduling and getting people to participate in oxidative phosphorylation, which would be like our long, steady state stuff, because they all do different things relative to specificity of training. And like every other system, there's a use it or lose it thing that happens normally within the aging process. It's tied into like the types of like muscle fiber types that we want to use in regards for specific tasks, or just not lose because of like age related sarcopenia. So we're training energy systems as much as we're training everything else, whether we're acknowledging it or whether it's important to us or whether it's a priority within the trainers and the client's mind. It's happening, so we might as well have some mindfulness around what we're doing, and that we're trying to at least be somewhat broad, and that we're challenging all the different energy systems, and it requires different intervention.
I love that. Now, you said something interesting there, and you're talking about like ATPC and then oxidative phosphorylation and then the fast twitch fiber stuff. I'm just curious, like, I maybe this is a super satellite view and jumping way too far ahead. But if you
Okay.
had someone who was a 65, 70-year-old individual, they have, low level of complications, so you can kind of periodize them as you will. How are you thinking? Because periodization colloquially is like very much like a fitness bodybuilding. Like I do cardio this time, and I do some muscle building stuff, and then some strength building stuff. And I know you're sort of thinking of it in that way, but you're thinking of it in a much more academic lens. How are you thinking about these different periodization phases, or rather, do you have go-to phases and time periods that you find are beneficial? The idea, there's something that just quickly comes to mind. I know there's a great Jordan Peterson quote about systems leaning towards what's being measured. And I know that if you're focusing on one thing, you end up sacrificing performance a little bit over here. But if you kind of swing back and forth and you navigate this well, you can kind of get an aggregate benefit that's beneficial.
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question. I think I mean the number one place that I start is I think, okay, well, what are all the things that I'm responsible for with this person, both relative to their goals and relative to biology and physiology, based upon where they are on the life continuum, right? Like I might say to myself, okay, well, this person is 67 with no exercise history. We know that the literature shows that type 2X muscle fibers have the highest atrophy and the highest migration rates when someone goes through the aging process without intervention. Those muscle fiber types are critical to have in place for things like reflexes if one falls, right? Which would also tie into the ATP CP energy system. So if I'm thinking, well, this person has already suffered some age related muscle loss because they're 67 with no exercise history, I want to reduce their ability, or I want to reduce the likelihood of them having a fall. I want to improve their ability to respond reflexively to a fall. what fiber type do we need to play that out, and what energy system feeds that fiber type. So I might roll it back from there and think, okay, so now what can that person? Here's the type of training or intervention that takes. How much can they tolerate that, right? And then I go through a lot of the practical experiments that you go through, and um, that our whole community goes through on figuring out what the person can tolerate, right? Oh, shoot, we did a little too much. Let me roll it back. No, that volume was fine, but the frequency was a little much. So that just comes down to really having your best laid plan with an academic guess, and then documenting well and trying to read the tea leaves of your data.
That's awesome. And then, so this new course, are you kind of going through some of these ideas and giving framing for periodization and things like that?
Yeah, we go through that. We go through the mechanisms of how they all work, what sort of exercise parameters that um, are best suited to utilize each one. Um, and then we tie that into inflammation, because ultimately, in the most direct way, um, the you know the aerobic energy systems, particularly oxidative phosphorylation, are really the heavy hitters in regards to attenuating inflammation resolution, meaning the cessation of inflammation. So, a conclusion. I'm going to go ahead and skip to the last page of the book. One of the conclusions that is reasonable to draw from understanding bioenergetics and from understanding inflammation processes, and from understanding why inflammation resolution is important, is that cardiovascular exercise um, is incredibly important in order to achieve those objectives and to get the outcomes that you want. And I think that that's something that we as an industry sort of lose sight of, or we just go, hey, you go do some cardio, without understanding that which is fine, but without understanding that there's a lot of intellectual property. Even if it's programming, they're not with you, but they can be with you. There's a lot of intellectual property that gives you value around how, why, when, and where someone doses their cardio, and for what reason, right?
Johnny, when this course is ready, like, sign me up for it, because I mean, I've been thinking about a lot of this stuff, and I'm excited to. You have a lot of wisdom and background with it, and I'm looking forward to learning more, because I find myself thinking in this way with a lot of clients, but I just don't have the background that you have. So I really appreciate your time and energy to create this thing. It just sounds
Yeah.
incredible.
Well, it's interesting, and I think I said this in one of our last podcasts when we talked about business. Is I see our community as a collective resource, right? There are people who I go to for things that's, I would come to you, or I would go to Jacques, or I might go to Macmillan for something that I'm like, hey, I have my head wrapped around this really well, or I think this is important, but my deeper dive is here, and my dive is more shallow there. Let me use them as a resource. And I think that's one of the things that has been great about your podcast, is I think it's expanded that really tight, small community that you and I came from, and has helped it reach more people. And I hope that people listening to this will begin to see our community like that as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I appreciate that. And I mean, that's the whole goal with this thing, is I think everybody has something incredible to offer. I bring on, and as such, I mean, you're a jerk, but you've got really incredible information. Now, on the inflammation thing, I got to tell you, and I don't know, you might laugh at this. My introduction to inflammation, as like my first year working with personal training, was through blueberries. I remember talking to people about nutrition. I'm not joking.
Anti-inflammatory, yeah.
Right. So I was like, oh, and I talked to a client. She had a little shoulder. And so I'm eating a lot of blueberries because they're anti-inflammatory. I was like, oh, inflammatory, anti. Okay, cool. And then it drove down that road. And there's this weird thing that, like, inflammation is like a very common thing for people. Just, I'm hurting. Oh, I have inflammation. And then you look at someone's blood work, and there's this weird separation where some people will have on their blood work high inflammatory markers, but maybe they don't hurt. And you have other people that have low inflammatory markers, and they subjectively don't like how their body feels. And so It's this really, like, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts around this whole thing because it's a really confusing world, and it's also like mainstream marketed in such a big way, like Goop and Gwyneth Paltrow and all these people, like they're going crazy with this stuff, and it's hard
Right.
to figure out like how do you have a conversation with someone about this thing and have it land.
Yeah, I think the important thing to understand, if you're going to have a conversation with people about this or teach a course, I think it's important for everyone to get comfortable with the concept that um, the the very mechanisms of inflammation that cause disease, that are linked to muscle atrophy and overtraining, that lead to wrecking hormonal systems. That very inflammation process that does that is also the exact same molecule for molecule, mechanism for mechanism system of repair. So it's the villain and it's the hero, and it's wearing both hat. It depends on the behaviors of it, right? So there's something called CLIP, which is chronic low inflammatory profile. Okay. That's sort of the stealthy inflammation that is linked to disease and all these other nasty things that happen to us biologically and physiologically when inflammation is not properly attenuated, right? So what it's really about is I need inflammation in order to repair from the stimulus of exercise or in order to fight a pathogen, right? So, any kind of a physiological insult, and we can throw exercise into the same boat in some regards as, as a pathogen, in that they're both stressors. Well, there's a response, right? Like we rally a response to those insults in order to fight pathogens and viruses, to repair damaged cells and tissues, and it's all the same process. Where it gets tricky and where problems come in is that when we sound that alarm, and we get all these cytokines and macrophages and all these pro-inflammatory signaling happens, the complicated biochemistry stuff, we can skip that over and say, look, when this thing sounds the alarm because it has a job to go do, we want it to go do that job, right? The problem is when there's no mechanisms or things in place in order to stop that process, right? When the job is done, it needs to be done. When it doesn't know the job is done and continues on, now you've got chronic inflammation, right? Versus acute inflammation. One is purposeful, one is dangerous. But it's the same exact process. So if you think about it, the what's cool about exercise is if you're exercising properly, you'll see someone's inflammation processes. If you were to put it on a graph, these huge spikes, right? And in these resolutions. These huge spikes and these resolutions, right? It looks like up and down, up and down, up and down, right? We've been told that there's this no inflammation line somewhere down there that is just smoke and mirrors and it's not real. What you have is kind of a mid grade constant line that doesn't sound enough alarms in order to rally enough of these mechanisms to do a job and then to be able to get the signaling to stop that job and come back down and then repeat. So it's like a stealthy, low level, chronic inflammatory profile that is really the dangerous one.
On that chronic end, I mean, there are the common, diseases like fibromyalgia and its
Hmm.
brother and sisters that have that have been touted as like the chronic inflammatory things.
Hmm.
Um, are there things that people do commonly day to day or exercising that accidentally create that chronic inflammation?
I mean, sure, there can be a number of things, right? Any kind of stressors that you put on yourself that were not being combated through exercise become a contributor, right? For example, body composition, right? So the adipose tissue itself, in the absence of exercise, produces cytokines that contribute to low level inflammation. That's why we see obesity linked to diabetes, congestive heart failure, et cetera, right? Because of that cytokine storm that is causing that we're not putting an intervention in place in order to bring that up to repair, finish the job, have things come in to stop that inflammation, and then bring it back down with the understanding that it's going to keep repeating itself over and over. So it's a sedentary lifestyle is really the biggest contributor to low level inflammatory profile. And then add on top of that, now you've got, stress from poor diet. You've got lack of sleep. You've got the change in someone's adiposity that comes from that. So it's mostly lifestyle. There are of course genetic factors to everything. Specific diseases are you know those transcription factors that cause those, and those have inflammatory profiles with them. But many um, of the diseases that have an inflammatory um, etiology to them are lifestyle based, unfortunately.
You mentioned the overweight individual, and I mean, I think that's a really common, I think, an area. And then that I have a question, and I'm sure it's going to sound almost basic, but the way you're saying it's just making me think it a little bit differently. You have an overweight individual, and they have higher inflammatory markers because of the adipose tissue. Then that
Hmm.
person contracts type 2 diabetes, and then that
Hmm.
type 2 diabetes wreaks havoc on their system and adds another layer of stress, and now there's more inflammation that becomes present. Then they start perhaps, and then they add some form of medication, and that's now adding help in some way, but then adding another pharmacokinetic stressor in another way, and it all
With
kind
a
of just stacks. I'm wondering. This is a weird question, and I think I know the answer, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have this stacking of stress, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and all these things are adding new layers of not new, but more inflammation and more consistent presence of inflammation, is it still, even though it may not feel good, is it still trying to help at a certain point, or is there a point of diminishing return?
So is the question that is the totality of all these layers of things that contribute to inflammation, can that add up to be enough to activate the mechanisms that stop inflammation?
Perhaps. I think that's a great way of wording it. Better than what I did. I'm just a
I
Canadian boy trying to do my best over here.
The answer is I don't think so. Because if you tie it into bioenergetics, it's the need to produce energy beyond what we are currently capable of doing that best activates those mechanisms, as well as things for like there are. I don't want to get outside of myself and go down too deep of a rabbit hole that I can't give enough information on. But with that demand for energy, particularly like the heat things called heat shock proteins, when our thermal dynamics get way up during oxidative phosphorylation or during any heavy bouts of exercise, there are specific things like P53. Is it P53 or P38 is a tumor suppressor, right? But that only becomes activated when we go deep enough into that oxidative phosphorylation for a specific amount of time, right? So many of those mechanisms that give you inflammation resolution, meaning, okay, job is done, no more inflammation, but then it starts to climb right back up, are also linked to those efforts specifically around bioenergetics. So if we're not trying to produce a bunch of ATP in ways that exceed our resting levels, we're going to have a difficult time solving that low level inflammation problem.
This is cool stuff, man. This is deep. But it's important because I think that, like you're saying, and I know right now we're going a little bit onto the deep end. You are, because you've got all this knowledge. I mean, it ultimately, a big part of this conversation comes back to how some of the quote unquote basic things that we've been doing with exercise, if dosed in the right direction, can really help with this.
Hugely. And that's why, you know, uh, it's so important that we look after every single benefit that exercise offers our clients, right? Right. People come to us for a lot of reasons, right? Maybe it's a bum shoulder, maybe it's their doctor told them to, whatever the reason, right? We know the expansive benefits of exercise. And no matter what the person's goal is, I've yet to run into a goal that somehow can't be tied back into m- muscle fiber type and energy systems and inflammation, whether the person's aware of it or not, right? Maybe someone's working on, I don't know, external rotation of their shoulder for a specific sport and the strength endurance just isn't there. Well, maybe that person needs to have a whole bunch of new capillaries in place for some new um, type 1 type 1 fiber through that muscle group in order to achieve that task and in order to get that mitochondrial and capillary biogenesis. It requires a specific energy system to be utilized for a specific period of time. You know, it's all tied in. So I think it's important that we remember that our favorite type of exercise, or just being afraid to paint outside of the lines with a client because it didn't match their expectation, um, that we don't get caught in that trap. Because if we have the knowledge, then we can set the expectation on why it's important. So if someone says to me, why should I stand here and have you direct my cardiovascular exercise? Well, Mrs. Smith, I'll tell you exactly why. So I wanted to sort of shed some light on why I think that's so important and why I think that um, that we don't get tunnel vision. I think that a lot of the courses that we develop are because we're afraid of our own selves. I know that I can get tunnel vision on things, and that terrifies me as a professional. So I need to make sure that I'm trying to widen my lens constantly, um, so that I don't get caught into that trap. And then either A, don't have the full breadth of value I would like to have, or miss out on business opportunities by not being able to serve people in 5, 10, 15 different ways that they didn't even know that they were coming to me for.
Yeah, well, the tunnel vision thing's a real thing. I mean, until I took a few different programs. I mean, I trained two different ways: heavy and hypertrophy, I would call it. And then I took a course, and I was like, okay, now I learned this new slow controlled thing with resistance profiles that match. This feels great. And I did the same three things for a long time. And it wasn't until I started, I mean, the exploration of oxidative, I mean, just how different ways to train for different energy systems has really become more prevalent, and I'm grateful for it. Even just today, I was doing a bunch of ski erg and more explosive jumping stuff, and one of my clients was like, "I never thought I'd see you do that," and I'm like, "Well, that's kind of the point. Is like there's a purpose to this." So it's kind of interesting. I think that tunnel vision thing is a real thing. But you said
Yeah.
something. And there's a great question from Dominic Newstill I'll ask here in a quick second, but it's I think it's that periodization is a great way of thinking of it, is that this time has this specific purpose, which will have this outcome, and we have to hang out here for a while. And sure, maybe you like that powerlifting thing, we can go there, but we need to do this for this. This will give us the opportunity to do this. And then it's just moving along, you know?
Brandon, I find myself almost like a horseshoe in where I am in my education right now, right? I come from you graduate from university and you're all exercise science and physiology. You go and you learn some practical stuff, and then you get into some outlier data, and then you kind of come back around almost full circle, but with a little more knowledge. But I constantly find myself coming back to two things you just mentioned. One, periodization. I have a lot of things I'm accountable for. I better loosely schedule it all in some way. And the said principle, if I want to specifically affect things, I better do things that specifically call demand upon those systems or those tissues.
I want to get back to Dominic's question, but one of the questions I get from a lot of our students is about retention. And I don't want to go businessy, but we'll come back here.
Okay.
But it's like, well, how, because I have several clients like you do. Many of my clients have been with me for 5+ years, and if not into the 10 category. Well, like, how do you do that? And it's some people think there's like some sort of salesy, businessy trick. And I'm like, there's communication stuff that is important and way you promote and show yourself and explain what you're doing. But at the end of the day, it comes down to periodization. And I mean that like in a very broad sense, that if you always have a direction and a destination based off of their objectives, there's no reason that this person shouldn't be working with you, finances, demographics, all that stuff. If that's working out, why they shouldn't be with you indefinitely, because there's always a project that you can move forward on this whole anti-aging continuum. And that forgetting about buzzwords, it comes back to periodization.
Right. There's always something to get to, and then something, and go back through it and go back through it, right? So I mean, the goal setting is continuous. That's why I don't necessarily subscribe to unless you're a therapist. I don't subscribe to this idea of of a finite amount of time or to achieve a certain goal, right? I mean, your goal is longevity and function, and that's in some ways a dangling carrot that we get to constantly eat, right?
Yeah.
So we just keep going. We keep going through that, and I think that it's important that we don't limit ourselves to what we are and who we are and to what we're doing for one person.
100%. I couldn't agree more. So, Dominic Newstow, he asked a long question, but I'll try and do my best to. This is great. When you're going through these different energy system protocols, are you using them with all forms of contractions and exercise? Myo, iso, plyo, and cardio. Also, are you changing the amount of time to elicit a different energy system, or is there more? Hope this makes sense.
I think it does, and the answer to all of it is yes, right? There's all kinds of interesting things that I do to mess around with these things. Some of them are my own little experiments, and some of them are just deeply steeped in the literature, right? Um, so when you look at the different energy systems, the literature does show you that a lot of these things are time dependent, right? So, for example, like the our first line of energy, which is the amount of ATP we have on board within a cell, within the mitochondria, called the ATP CP system, which is the most anaerobic system that we have. Lasts anywhere the literature would say from 15 to like 30 seconds, based upon what's the person is adapted to in regards to their training. So with that knowledge, maybe there's something I want to do where I'm like, you know what? I want to max that system out. So I might have someone do, I'm just going to make some stuff up here. All right, I'm going to get you on like a Kaiser knee extension. And we're going to do where it's a little safer on the knee joints. We're going to do power work as heavy and hard as you can tolerate for 20 seconds, right? And then I'm immediately gonna go and put you on a leg press, or maybe I'll do it. Maybe I'll go right away. Maybe I'll parcel it out depending on who the person is. And then we're gonna go into like a 6 minute leg press. So we've kicked the table out from those type 1 fibers because we've fatigued from the type from the type 2X fibers because we fatigued that that ATP CP system, hypothetically according to the literature. And now I'm going to go in and do like a really long extended set because I know that the next energy system is fast and slow glycolysis that uses the type 2B fibers until those pan out, and then I'll be getting really into that type 1 stuff. So I've tried to take them by the way I load or using different load profiles in order to have their energy system be taxed in a certain way that I can loosely predict which fiber types they're using. So at the end of that 6 minutes of leg press, they're probably using a predominant amount of type 1 fibers, at least more so than they would have been um, had I just put them on a leg press straight away. Those type 1 fibers require a little more of the aerobic energy systems than the type 2X and the type 2B. So I'm trying to parse out how those things work together. Now, someone might say, well, why is that important? Well, maybe the person skis. Maybe it's not important for them for a functional outcome. Maybe I just go, well, I'm responsible for training all these things, and I have to give them a comprehensive approach, and this is the safest way I can think of to do it. So you'd have a hard time convincing me that there was someone who wouldn't benefit from that, whether it was specific to a goal or not. Is to their goal is different than whether or not it meets an important goal.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Illinois, I just can't stop thinking that you would be a shredded bodybuilder right now if you were using all this time in your bodybuilding heyday.
Right? Geez, if I only knew then what I know now.
Jeez, man. So let's kind of like flip this. I mean, and this is incredible. And I would definitely say, like, through everything you're doing, you and Michelle through bioacademics, I'm excited to hear about this course. And when you got it up, please send me the art. I want to share it because I want to take it. And I think other people should take it too. I think you got a world of wisdom in that noggin of yours. And you guys have another course coming up soon too, don't you?
We're gonna do another cadaver course
Nice.
coming up before too long. Um, that course, man, that is it doesn't matter like what your scientific background is. If you're if you're new to training and you just got your A certification, or if you got a PhD in physiology or whatever it is, we have such a broad um, population come through that course, and everyone just walks away so impressed with how they're able to see the human body in ways that they previously couldn't, right? We do a lot of hypothesizing for what we think is going on underneath the skin because we have an idea or because we have seen pictures or even our cool apps. But when you see it and get your hands on it, it is a different experience, and it really does give you kind of that like Neo from the Matrix understanding of what you're working with under there.
Well, and anyone that's listening to this in the future, if you guys are ever near the greater Chicago area, or you can fly there to check out one of these cadaver courses, I took it with someone named Joe DeAntonis in Pittsburgh,
Right?
four
His
or
is great.
five. Yeah, but you know what? Like forgetting about who's teaching it, like just having that time with a skin pulled back body and looking at the thing that we're trying to affect, and taking away the images that we've seen in Clemente's anatomy and actually putting it in real time, like it is. There's no other word to describe how impactful it is at any academic level. Like, so anyone should take your course for sure.
And it's also, the thing that I hear the most, Brandon, when people finish that course over the years is people are like, wow, I mean, things really aren't as cut and dry with the attachment sites and what's interdigitated with what. You really can only be ballpark specific on what you're training. I'm like, uh-huh. Like if someone's like, oh, I'm going to isolate the short head of the bicep, I'm like, okay,
Well,
good luck.
let's talk about that for a second. By the way, before we shift gears, because that's something I want to say, Ahmed, who's one of our FPM students, said, sign me up. He's going to do your inflammation course soon as it's there. So you got to start telling us when it's happening, man, so he comes and hangs out with you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you guys, let's put it out there, and if people show interest, I'll reach out to everyone, and this would be the the beta launch of the second version.
Online or in person?
We could do it either way.
If you do it online, I will definitely be there. In person, I've got children that slow down a lot of things, but we can make it happen. The isolated muscle thing is funny because I have seen it. We've been a part of this isolated methodology, thinking about limiting and focusing to specific muscles. Then you start looking at the cadavers and you go, okay, well, this is completely crazy. It's impossible to isolate gemellus inferior from superior and piriformis. Like they're just like sandwiched in there. And then now I'm seeing so-called academics on social media platforms full swinging back into it, trying to showcase how this exercise is for this division of glute and this division of this muscle. And it's, what do you think's going on there? What do you think's going on there?
I think they might be right if they were applying that model to a model, right? In the sense of like, okay, well, if I could create a human, right? Like if this were like Westworld, yeah, sure, we could absolutely, what you're describing would make sense and would probably be able to localize that tissue. However, we're not cyborgs from Westworld. We are humans that all have an incredibly unique and different stress history from one another, incredibly different expressions of our DNA and our messenger RNA, and incredibly different lever systems that went through different things, right? So it'd be hard to tell them they were wrong if what they were applying it to was what they thought it was. But just take one cadaver course and you'd be like,
Well, so let's say I'll play a game with me, and I just want to hear your answer because I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm just curious.
are
Right?
you giving me trouble?
Someone does some surface EMG and they do the deltoids and they see anterior, medial, and posterior delt. And they change the angle of their side raise and the force angle. And they find at this particular angle and at this particular angle with the cable, if they do a specific profile, the medial delt lines up, lightens up, whatever that means, there's a bit of noise, by 30 more percent. If they train with this information, will they grow more muscle in that area?
I mean, yeah, the STED principle, man. Specific adaptation to impose. I mean, that's why I have a callus right there because my ring is there and it specifically adapts to that specific force in that specific place. So,
Fair
but I
enough.
don't know if we can, if that's the same. I don't know that that's an apples to apples comparison in order to serve as absolute evidence that somehow because I was able to control the external force to target a certain range of or a certain part of a muscle, that it's uh, had greater atrophy or that it had greater EMG reading, and maybe the atrophy would be different. Maybe it would be throughout the whole muscle. I don't.
Fair enough. Well, listen, I got you for about 10 more minutes. I don't want to take much more of your time, but I want to ask you something. With all of this stuff around inflammation and thinking about working with more sensitive demographics per se, one thing that, I mean, I think we've done a good job here at Strata, but it's like universally still a big problem is how do you market and advertise this methodology? Because we start getting into this world, and I posted a question yesterday, and I was thinking about you when I posted it, and a few people went off on it, which is kind of fun. This idea of being a science trainer, it's this weird road, right? Like if you go full academic and you share all the information you just shared with me in marketing forums, even sales meetings and whatever it may be, meeting new people, it's so far away that even though it's pragmatic, it's very important, it's too much and people get overwhelmed and they're not attracted to it. How do you, I mean, PHP is doing an incredible job, but how do you think about what you do and marketing and advertising?
We learned the hard way that the old tried and true adage of keep it simple is really the best avenue to go, right? Like somewhat for me to say, hey, I have specific strategies that will improve your health and avoid disease. That's going to interest someone who's looking to hire us, more so than like we're going to isolate the mechanisms of inflammation and make sure that you're properly getting resolution after a spike, right? I mean, like, who are you talking to, right? And I think that we were trying for many years trying to be overly impressive with what we were trying to put out there, that I don't know that we reached quite as many people who we otherwise would, just by being like, we're we're here to help, right? And that information, I think, comes through as you build the relationship, right? If you build the right relationship, you have years and years and years and years and years to explain it to someone why they should stay. All you need at first is a reason why they should show up, and those are the simplest of reasons. Show up because this. I got a million reasons that I'll convince you why you need to stay. But if I open with those, people are gonna have the same marketing response that the people in that first beta launch of the information course had, like, or, or asleep, right?
So then maybe this is a silly question, but there is a huge group of people that call themselves science trainers or scientifically minded or evidence based, and they've learned a couple small things, learned a couple cool small things, but they maybe have learned like what a moment arm is, and they go, "I'm a science based trainer," and there's these people who just run with it, and then there are people who I would say are like you and Michelle and everyone else at PHP that I've met so far that are truly like deep diving into learning as much as they can. And I would say, like, without staying away from marketing words and potentially poking the bear by labeling, I would say you are like scientifically minded trainers. How does someone who's like you differentiate themselves from the pack?
Well, I think there's two questions there. I think one question might be, how do they do that from a marketing perspective? And I think that the other question is, how do they do that with the experience of a client, right? The marketing one, I think is more challenging. I think that there's tricks that I don't know, and imagery, the imaging and certain trigger words that might lend itself to that feel of really having some insider information. But I think those messages need to be simple. I think that the real business benefit is in retention, right? I mean, I forget where I heard this. Years ago, a friend of mine had restaurants, and he's like, it's easy to get someone to come to your restaurant once, it's hard to get them to come twice, right? And I think that applies to what we do too, right? If someone's even Googling us, they are looking for help with they want exercise to help them in some way. So maybe we use a word like, advanced techniques. All right, it seems catchy and whatever, but we can't expect someone off of an ad or a marketing campaign to understand intimately who we are and what we do the way someone who has worked with us for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years has. So I think that it's how you constantly and slowly and in meaningful and scientifically accurate ways show your clients your value and explain in simple ways why you're doing what you're doing and why it might be different someday, and why you probably won't be doing the exact same things down the road.
I love it. Johnny, I love having you on. I feel like I could pick your brain for a million. Like, just I love your perspective on a lot of these things. If you don't mind me asking, this is kind of my last question for you, and then you can tell me to F off and you can get back to your busy day running business over there. Do you have a book that you're excited about or that you could recommend for anyone that's listening to this?
On an exercise related topic, or just
Whatever
on?
you want. Whatever you want.
Well, I currently right now am rereading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I think that, to me, I
Oh,
think that understanding philosophy is very important to understanding science, and I find myself getting a little tunnel vision and not being reflective enough upon what I'm doing or what I'm applying, and then I try to go that route. So I'm rereading Marcus Aurelius, and believe it or not, when I do things like that, it helps me recapture certain things I have stored that I've forgotten about. And in some ways, when I'm through a phase like that, inspires me to maybe tackle or retackle a certain area of science that's specifically related to what we do.
We'll talk about OG going Marcus Aurelius, man. Like I'm gonna download that book and jump into that right away. I won't lie,
So
that's gonna be
good,
awesome.
man. And the most amazing thing about that, and I didn't even think about this until I heard on a podcast someone talking about the book. Was that those meditations were never meant for consumption. We got this guy, how many eons ago, writing these things personally for himself only, thinking they'd never see the light of day, let alone this many millennia later, right? So it's kind of cool to know that there's some deep authenticity to those words because
Something
they
beautiful
weren't
about books.
yeah they weren't meant to convince anyone of anything except himself.
There's something that's so timelessly powerful from words, and I think that's like if someone wants to live forever at the moment, I think that's the best way you can do it, is like document how you think about things, and hopefully people pick it up and read it a few hundred years later, or 1,000.
Agreed.
Johnny, thank you so much, man. I appreciate your time. Anyone who's listening to this, Johnny Cooke, Precision Human Performance. He's in Chicago and Bioacademics. Check out their courses. Check out their trainers. Follow all their trainers, everyone there. We're actually having Aaron Westbrook on from your place to talk about internship stuff. Because he's awesome. So we're digging into the PHP pool.
Yeah, love it.
Cool.
Well,
John,
Brandon, thanks for having me. Wonderful work as always. I hope I didn't take too meandering of a road through the questions, but if anyone needs clarification, they can email me, or if they want to correct me where I made a mistake, I'm always open to that too.
Johnny, thank you so much. Please, when you have the courses up, send me the art and I'll share it. And we got some people, and I'm interested in your bioenergetics course. It's going to be awesome.
Will do, man.
Cool, Johnny. Have a good one.
See you, bud.